Just so you know, this show is about scary stuff. So don't say I didn't warn you guys. And remember, don't be scared.
Episode 117. Tess, War Baby here with another episode of Murderous Minors. Going off to college is a rite of passage for many, but honestly, the thought scares me to death. All I can think about when fresh-faced young adults skip naively into independent living is, please watch your back, because the excitement of what's to come can be blinding. On this episode of Murderous Minors, we take a look at the December 11th, 2019 murder of Barnard College freshman 18-year-old Tessa Majors on the steps of Upper Manhattan's Morningside Park. Tessa had come to New York City to attend the liberal women's college near Columbia University, with her admissions essay reading, quote, "As an avid feminist, I have striven towards bridging my community gender divide by being outspoken in my classes, taking an intensive course on social justice, and campaigning for a congressional candidate. I enjoy taking difficult classes and feel invigorated when forced outside of my intellectual comfort zone. I embrace the culture of positivity and growth at Barnard." It was the kind of exciting place that this Charlottesville, Virginia area native could get an Ivy League education, while indulging passions like journalism and music as she decided what career path to take. The recent graduate of St. Anne Belfield School with a distinctive green-tinted bob haircut was accomplishing much on her new campus already. The daughter of a novelist and English professor, Tessa as of yet had no definitive educational path, but her professors and classmates could see that she was intuitive, insightful, and often first to offer alternative perspectives in class. Before she'd gone off to college, she'd completed an internship with the Augusta Free Press and shown she had what it takes to have a career as a journalist. An editor there recalled her impressive work ethic and how, quote, "she went full bore into everything." But what had really drawn her all the way to New York City was music. Tessa sang and played the bass guitar in two bands, one called The Company and the other, a punk rock band called Patient Zero, who'd released their first single in March 2019 and their first album called Girl Problems in September of that same year. Conversations full of talk of starting other bands happened often for Tessa, who had a way of making deep connections after meeting someone once. Patient Zero had gigged for the first time in New York City in October and had shows booked in Tessa's Virginia hometown for over the upcoming winter break from school, signaling the end of her first semester away from home. By late 2019, the expansive Morningside Park outside of Barnard College's Upper Manhattan, New York campus had been experiencing a resurgence of sorts after decades of avoidance by locals. It's a shame, too, because it's lovely, with mature wood lines and flights of beautiful stone staircases leading to street level and acting as a scenic route from one part of the city to another for those who were brave enough to take it. Although it offers an idyllic path, college students and residents of the neighborhoods that border Morningside Park avoid it for safety reasons. For decades, women especially have avoided its welcoming seclusion, and people seen walking in the park after dark were either considered ignorant or up to no good. It acts as a border, both physically and figuratively, between Harlem and the university community. Tessa landed in the area at a time when New York City overall enjoyed their lowest crime rates in years, although 2019 did see an increase in Morningside Park assaults by youngsters taking cell phones and electronics. A May 2019 article from the West Side Rag described a series of sneak attacks reported in the preceding weeks where groups of kids appearing to be between 12 and 15 sucker punched their targets from behind before robbing them. Between June and December 2019, 5 robbery reports were filed that named the stairs at Morningside Drive and 116th Street as the site of their assaults, but none had resulted in death, meaning that these incidents weren't highly publicized. When Tessa Majors entered Morningside Park just before 7 p.m. on December 11, 2019, she wasn't thinking about any of that, but was more likely thinking that the only thing standing between her and winter break was finals. As she entered the park from one direction, 3 middle school kids from Harlem's premier PS 180 entered from another. They began following a man but got spooked. And then Tessa approached 14-year-old Rashaun Weaver, 14-year-old Luchiano Lewis, and a third teen, their 13-year-old friend. Lewis would later describe the scene in court, saying, quote, "She had just walked up the long set of stairs and was walking toward us, but she was looking down at her phone. We were walking on the right side with the rails. When she passed us on our left, I saw Rashaun whisper something to the 13-year-old, but I couldn't hear what he said. Rashaun turned around, ran up behind Tessa Majors, and kicked her hard in the back. I watched her stumble. Rashaun started screaming, 'Give me your money, run your pockets, I'm not playing.'" Surveillance footage from the college security kiosk at the top of the stairs grainily captured some of what happened next in the darkness. Lewis and Weaver attacked Tessa as the 13-year-old stood about 10 feet away. Lewis later claimed, quote, "I do not know exactly where the 3 of us were when Rashaun stabbed Tessa Majors because he tussled with her in 2 different places, near the tree when we first saw her and then again at the bottom of the big stairs that go back and forth." She asked the teens if they were seriously trying to rob her. Just days before, Morningside Park surveillance footage had captured Weaver stealing an iPhone at knife point, which he later used to check his email. After Tessa briefly escaped her attackers twice, they pursued her again and Lewis subdued her in a headlock, while Weaver grabbed things out of her coat pockets, including a plastic bag, then pulled out a knife and, quote, "hit her with it because she wouldn't hand over her phone." She bit him hard on the finger as they fought. Lewis would later allege that it was Weaver's idea for the 3 middle school friends to, quote, "do robberies in Morningside Park." It was something he'd been doing and had been trying to get Lewis to do too, according to Lewis, that is. He said that he'd gone with Weaver on several occasions, but had been too scared to actually assault anyone, going on to admit that just 4 days before Tessa's murder, they'd in fact assaulted a man in the park together. Lewis would later try to convince the court that, quote, "I know Rashaun had a knife that night, but using a knife was not part of our plan. Camera footage showed the altercation from a distance, but it was dark and specific details were too far away to see, other than one of the 2 attackers motioning at Tessa while the youngest accomplice stood to the side. Though gravely injured, she found the strength to climb the remaining steps that got her to street level and into the view of a college security guard. She staggered around for a minute but seemed like a winded jogger, but within moments she'd collapsed against a light post and ended up face down surrounded by blood. Several witnesses who were at street level heard her say, "Help me, I'm being robbed," before she appeared mortally wounded at the top of the steps. Tessa Majors had been stabbed 4 times in the chest, including once in the heart. Her cell phone was found on the ground and was used to identify her. It was the one thing the teens wanted to rob her of, but it was also the one thing she would likely never give up. According to one of her parents' victim impact statements, Tessa had years' worth of songs she'd written stored in that phone that likely weren't anywhere else. She was planning to record them in the studio when she got home over Christmas break. All three of the teens fled, and the following day, Thursday, December 12th, the 13-year-old boy was spotted by police and followed into the lobby of an apartment building not too far from Morningside Park. He was arrested on suspicion of criminal trespass after officers matched the clothes and shoes he was wearing to that of one of the three suspects from the day before. He had a knife that he said he was holding for a friend, but it was not the murder weapon. When he was questioned at the station in the company of his uncle, detectives told him that they had evidence linking him to Tessa's murder. The boy eventually turned to his uncle and explained that he and his two friends, Luchiano Lewis and Rashaun Weaver, had looked for someone to mug and eventually surrounded Tessa. He claimed that Lewis had restrained her while Weaver had stabbed her, although he didn't realize she was being stabbed until he saw feathers fly from her jacket. His public defender would later argue that the interrogation should not be admissible at trial because the admission was coerced by deception and because her client didn't have an attorney present. The 13-year-old was ultimately charged with robbery, criminal possession of a weapon, and second-degree felony murder as a juvenile, which is why we won't name him here, but his statement led police to Lewis and Weaver, who were charged as adults. The boy was ordered held without bond. The felony murder charge stemmed from the fact that although he didn't physically participate in the murder, he did actively participate in the crime which came before it. Without the robbery, there would have been no opportunity for the murder to have taken place, making all parties culpable in Tessa's death. This was the teen's first arrest, and after a few weeks in juvenile detention, his attorney tried to get him released to his aunt and uncle, but was denied at a hearing on January 3, 2020. She tried to argue that he had a stable home life and wasn't a flight risk, but the judge concluded that the teen was right where he needed to be. Word of Tessa's murder just outside Barnard College hit the news within hours, and over the following days, officials tried to dissuade any victim blaming, especially after president of the police union, the Sergeants Benevolent Association, said on the radio show The Cat's Roundtable that, quote, "What I'm understanding is that she was in the park to buy marijuana. Here we have a student murdered by a 13-year-old. We have a common denominator, marijuana," while referring to what detectives had allegedly heard from a friend of Tessa's, as well as information they'd received from neighbors about the boy they already had in custody. The interview drew allegations that he was politicizing Tessa's murder to take shots at then-Mayor Bill de Blasio, especially because he'd gone on in the interview to say, quote, "I understand the mayor made statements that this is surprising on how this can happen in New York City. I really have to question what world he's living in to think that this is surprising when we are watching the city slowly erode with shootings, stabbings, an increase in homicides, and most importantly, a hands-off policing policy. We don't enforce marijuana laws anymore. We're basically hands-off on the enforcement of marijuana. Something needs to change, and it needs to change quickly, or it's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle." Within hours, the mayor tweeted his retort with a link to an article about the interview saying, quote, "Think of Tessa's parents, her friends. This is heartless. It's infuriating. We don't shame victims in this city." The Majors family released their first statement on their daughter's murder following that interview, saying, quote, "The remarks by Sergeants Benevolent Association President Ed Mullins we find deeply inappropriate, as they intentionally or unintentionally direct blame onto Tess, a young woman, for her own murder. We would ask Mr. Mullins not to engage in such irresponsible public speculation, just as the NYPD asked our family not to comment as it conducts the investigation." Another concern around this investigation was that the mistakes made in the notorious, quote, Central Park 5 case weren't repeated. Many of you may be familiar with the highly publicized case from 30 years ago, which involved the rape of a New York woman in Central Park and the wrongful convictions of 5 teens. The cases shared racial elements, and investigators videotaped all interrogations and enlisted the assistance of the prosecutor's office immediately to cover their backs. The 13-year-old had been the first to make contact with authorities. However, the next day, and just hours after his interrogation, Lewis had shown up but requested the presence of an attorney and declined to speak to police. The district attorney's office didn't have enough evidence to charge him with anything yet because in New York, you couldn't be convicted based solely on someone else's testimony. They needed more, so emphasis was heavily placed on other evidence that could help secure charges against him. In the meantime, Weaver had yet to be located, and 9 days after the crime, the NYPD released his photograph to the public in an effort to find him. Investigators believed that his family was keeping him hidden while the bite that Tessa was thought to have inflicted healed. And after what police called a, quote, 2-week manhunt ended, 14-year-old Rashaun Weaver was found at a family member's home in the Bronx on December 26, 2019. He was questioned in the presence of his lawyer for several hours but was released the same day without being charged. None of the DNA tests had yielded conclusive results yet, and the investigation continued. They had recovered and examined blood samples and clothing from all 3 suspects, and had tested Tessa's clothing, mouth, and her fingernail clippings as well, and in the end, it was the DNA results which provided the evidence necessary to secure their arrests. Most profoundly, the DNA found under Tessa Majors' fingernails matched 14-year-old Rashaun Weaver, allowing him to be arrested in the lobby of his apartment building at around 10:30 on February 14, 2020. Even though he was aware that he was a suspect in Tessa's murder, he committed other crimes. About 5 hours prior to his arrest, Weaver and 3 other teens had lured a man to a location and attacked him, beating him viciously in the head before leaving with his shoes, his cell phone, and over $100 in cash. 5 hours later, Weaver was arrested, and 2 months after the murder, he was charged with robbery, second-degree intentional murder, and second-degree felony murder, and police were confident that they had the teen who committed the stabbing in custody. He faced 5 years to life. In addition, Weaver had been heard on a recorded line prior to his February 2020 arrest, admitting to his involvement while speaking to his incarcerated father. When released from Mohawk Correctional Facility where he was being held on a parole violation, the man secured pro bono counsel for his son. Trial attorney Jeremy Lichtman, who represented El Chapo, took the case, saying that he felt for the teen because he had twin sons his age. When Weaver was arrested, police had already begun to close in on Luchiano Lewis as well. 5 days after Weaver was apprehended, Lewis surrendered to police with his attorney at his side, also charged with second-degree murder and robbery. The 13-year-old accomplice, who was charged as a juvenile, was the first to resolve his case, pleading guilty to the robbery charge on June 3, 2020, and admitting that, quote, "We went to the park planning to rob someone. In the park, one of my friends dropped a knife. I picked up the knife and handed it to Rashaun. After that, we saw Tessa Majors walking on the stairs inside the park. Rashaun went up to her and Tessa yelled for help. Rashaun used the knife that I had handed to him to stab Tessa, and I saw feathers coming out of her coat. Then I saw Rashaun take a plastic bag out of her pocket. Tessa went up the stairs toward Morningside Drive, and Rashaun, Lucci, and I followed her up to the platform. After that, Rashaun, Lucci, and I ran out of the park together." 2 weeks later, the teen was back in Manhattan Family Court, receiving the maximum sentence of 18 months in juvenile detention, 6 months of which was to be served in a limited secure facility. Attorneys from the Legal Aid Society acted as his public defenders, and they pointed out that there was no DNA evidence against him and that he neither touched nor robbed Tessa Majors. Lewis spent 18 months in jail awaiting trial before pleading guilty in Manhattan Supreme Court on September 21, 2021. He didn't receive any kind of deal regarding his sentence, and he placed heavy blame on Weaver, claiming that he didn't know Tessa had died until the next day. He said that people were talking about a murder in the park, so he'd looked it up, and there, staring back at him from his phone, was, quote, "the girl we had robbed." Reading from a prepared statement at his hearing, he said, quote, Rashaun turned around, ran up behind Tessa Majors and kicked her hard in the back. I watched her stumble. Rashaun started screaming, give me your money, run your pockets, I'm not playing. Lewis said he heard Tessa call him a coward as the three of them struggled, telling the court that after they'd run off, Weaver told him, quote, the bitch bit me. When he was sentenced the following month on October 14, 2021, he received the maximum sentence allowed for his age, 9 years to life for Tessa's murder, and a concurrent sentence of 40 months for robbery. While in jail awaiting trial, he'd already had a poor disciplinary track record, leading Justice Mandelbaum to conclude that, quote, I agree that one bad choice, even one horrific choice, standing alone should not prevent leniency in the case of a young offender. But the defendant has demonstrated in a year and a half since this terrible incident that this is not an aberration. Sadly and troubling, the defendant has learned no lessons from his experience in this case, adding that, quote, the murder of Tessa Majors tore at the fabric of this entire city. He has his whole life ahead of him, but Tessa Majors does not. In his statement at sentencing, Lewis said, quote, as a human, I feel ashamed, embarrassed, and sad. Going on to say, Dad, I am sorry I failed you. I promise I will make you proud again. 2 months later, Rashaun Weaver, then 16, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in Manhattan Supreme Court, the last of the trio to do so, a little over 2 years after Tessa's murder, admitting, quote, I intentionally caused the death of Tessa Majors by stabbing her with a knife. He'd also been indicted and charged for the Valentine's Day 2020 robbery and assault that he'd taken part in just hours before he was arrested for stabbing Tessa, and for the assault and robbery from a few days before Tessa's murder, where he used his victim's phone to check his email. In all, Weaver had charges pending stemming from 3 separate crime sprees, pleading guilty to the most serious count in each case on December 16, 2021. At his sentencing the following month, on January 19, 2022, District Attorney Matthew Bogdanos pointed out that he, quote, didn't just attack her once. He didn't just stab her once. He stabbed her 4 times. 4 times in the chest. He portrayed the teen as unremorseful, saying that proof lay in the video Weaver made of himself smoking marijuana that he said he'd stolen from Tessa the day after he'd killed her. But Weaver's defense attorney claimed that his client had expressed his remorse, quote, hundreds of times, adding that he was a, quote, symptom rather than cause of a broken system, citing his unstable home life that included living in public housing or homeless shelters, and with a father who was incarcerated repeatedly. Weaver spoke, thanking his family for continuing to support him, telling his 5 relatives in attendance, quote, you continue to love me as society hates me. He went on to say, quote, I want to apologize to the court and government and your honor. Mostly, I want to apologize to Tessa's family. She deserved to have a long life. I never set out to harm her, and I would give anything to go back in time so that it never happened. Rashaun Weaver received 14 years to life. Tessa Majors' family has never spoken to the press about her murder, but as each of the teens were sentenced, they prepared victim impact statements which were read by a representative in court and released to the media. For the 13-year-old sentencing hearing in June 2020, the Majors family wrote, quote, there are no words adequate to describe the pain and suffering that the family of Tess Majors has endured since her death by murder. On Labor Day weekend 2019, the parents of Tess Majors dropped her off at Barnard College in New York City to begin her freshman year of college. 100 days later, they brought her home to Virginia in an urn. What words could be used to describe that grief? Compounding the sudden loss of their talented, kind, and beloved daughter, sister, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, cousin, and niece is the incredibly violent nature of her death, which has been described in grisly detail by the respondent himself. The family can, however, articulate how these hearings have amplified their pain, On December 12th, the day after Tess Majors was murdered in Morningside Park, the respondent confessed to his role in her slaying. 6 months later, in his plea deal, the respondent has confessed to telling the truth in December. The Majors family wonders what these hearings have been about. The family notes the negotiated parsings of language of the plea deal, which studiously avoids use of the word murder. They note as well the language used by the Legal Aid Society in their press release regarding the plea deal, which states that, quote, Tess Majors' death was tragic. Regarding this description of events, some might wonder if perhaps Tess Majors was involved in an accident. Tess Majors did not die in an accident. Tess Majors was murdered, plain and simple, and no amount of semantic gymnastics changes that fact. The family also notes that, from December 12th until this day, the respondent has shown a complete lack of remorse or contrition for his role in the murder of Tess Majors. By his own admission, the respondent picked up a knife that had fallen to the ground and handed it to an individual who then used it to stab Tess Majors to death. This family can't help but wonder what would have happened if that knife had been left on the ground. The family of Tess Majors was also impacted by the statement put out by the Corporation Counsel for the City of New York, which claimed that the respondent was, quote, not the main actor in the murder. As far as the family is concerned, there are no minor actors in the murder of Tess Majors. The Corporation Counsel's statement also states that this plea deal resolution is, quote, in the best interest of the community. The Majors family wonders how many in the community, any community including the many Tess was a part of and the ones that her family members continue to be a part of, would agree with this assessment. Tess would have turned 19 on May 11th. That day has come and gone without her. The Majors family has experienced their first Christmas without her, a holiday that will be forever tainted by sharing the month of her murder. The first Mother's Day without her has come and gone. The first Father's Day without her will be this Sunday. The Majors family wakes up thinking about her and goes to bed thinking about her. Her absence is palpable and unrelenting. For Luchiano Lewis's sentencing, they wrote, on December 11th, 2019, the hopes and dreams for our daughter Tess came to a tragic end. Nearly 2 years later, we still find words inadequate to describe the immeasurable pain, trauma, and suffering that our family has endured since her senseless murder. Tess was a brilliant student, a voracious reader, a poet, and a fledgling journalist. She had big dreams. She loved everything about music, writing it, performing it, listening to it. She volunteered at the local animal shelter. She spent summers attending nature camp where she loved learning about the environment and the natural world around her. She loved meeting new people with different ideas and beliefs than her own. But mostly she loved her family and friends, her cats, and especially her younger brother. They were best friends, and his sense of loss is profound and indescribable. Tess was a friend to the friendless and kind in all the little ways that people remember forever. And she was brave. Her family misses her every moment of every day. Our hearts ache as we watch Tess's friends return to school, perform concerts, start jobs, and experience all the things that our daughter never will. It is hard for many old friends to be around us. Our grief is too profound. We are too changed from the people we used to be. With every legal proceeding, we're forced to relive the events of December 11th, 2019. We have not been able to grieve our daughter properly or in peace. Nearly 2 years after her murder, we still have very little closure. The family of Tess Majors believes that murder shouldn't be normalized or rationalized. And to those other parents who have prematurely lost a child, particularly at the hands of another human being, you have our empathy. Our lives are forever changed, and not a day goes by that we don't think about what could have been for Tess's future. Not a day goes by that we don't consider what could have been done to prevent her brutal and, again, senseless death. At Rashaun Weaver's sentencing, they wrote, quote, "This is a victim impact statement. The victim is Tess Majors. Tess Majors cannot say how being murdered impacted her because she is dead. She is dead forever and will not be coming back. The family of Tess Majors doesn't know what Tess would say at this moment about being murdered by Rashaun Weaver. They know she was against murder and violence in general and that she never harmed another human being in her 18 years on the planet. They have no idea what it is like to experience what she experienced. No idea what it is to fight with 3 males, all of them larger than she, for over a minute, escaping 2 times only to be surrounded and targeted again. They have no idea what it's like to fight for an iPhone for the simple matter that it contained 3 years' worth of songs she'd written. Songs she was planning to record over the winter break, which was only a week away. As far as the family knows, those songs were stored nowhere else but on her phone. They have no idea what it's like to stumble up a long flight of stairs after being stabbed multiple times in the chest, her phone still in her hand. They have no idea what it's like to try and hail an Uber ride while sitting on a city bench after being stabbed. No idea what it is like to bleed to death on a New York City street in the presence of strangers next to a security booth. How could they or anyone else know what she felt? The only person who knows what it's like to be murdered early on the evening of December 11th, 2019 by Rashaun Weaver and 2 cohorts is Tess Majors, and she isn't here. She is not in this courtroom, or attending a class, or playing music, or laughing with friends. She no longer exists on planet Earth. She is gone, and she is gone forever. Tess Majors' father is here, in this courtroom. He continues to live. The mother of Tess Majors is in this courtroom. She continues to live. Tess Majors' teenage brother continues to live. Her grandmothers continue to live. Her beloved great-grandmother outlived her by nearly 2 years, dying peaceably at the age of 103. The family of Tess Majors believes that human life is sacred. The family of Tess Majors believes that murder, one human being extinguishing another human being, should never be normalized or rationalized. The family of Tess Majors misses her every second of every day and will continue to do so as long as they are living and sentient. Their pain is immeasurable and does not go away.